Okay, so in the last lesson, we learned how to use our web part context as well as the SP HTTP client to make web service requests to our SharePoint REST services. In this lesson, we're going to take that functionality, the web part context, as well as its SP HTTP client, and we're going to export that into a service class that's basically going to abstract all of that functionality and make it a lot more portable and easier to use in all of the areas of our application, including this web part entry file, as well as any React components that may need to utilize that. So what we'll do is we'll jump into our solution here, and I'm going to create a new folder inside of source. And this folder is going to be called services. And this could just be used to contain any type of external services or web requests you need to make. And one of those services in this case is going to be SharePoint. And within this SharePoint folder, we'll create a new file that we can call SharePoint service.ts. This is just a pure TypeScript file. So the way this is going to work is we're going to create a export class SharePoint service manager inside of this file. So we're going to have this SharePoint Service Manager class, and that's going to have the methods in it that are going to allow us to do things like go out and get the list from our current web, or go out and get the list items from this particular list. But what we want to do is we ultimately want to import the functionality into the other areas of our application. So I'm going to use what you could call a singleton pattern. So what we'll do down below here is we'll say a constant variable called SharePoint Service is going to equal a new instance of the SharePoint Service Manager. And then we can export default SharePoint Service. And basically what that means is every time you import SharePoint Service from this file, no matter where it is in the application and no matter how many times you import it, you're going to have the same instance of this Service Manager. So there's only actually going to be one instance that you initialize once, and then you can reuse that all over your application wherever you need it. Cool. So let's come up here, and what we'll need is, first of all, we need a reference to our web part context. So that's going to be public context of type web part context, and it'll import that from the SP web part base package up above. We also need to know what our environment type is, so we can create public environment type of type environment type. And again, it'll import that up above as well. Now, these two properties that we've just created on this class are not initialized. So right now they're equal to undefined, and we don't actually know what the web part context and the environment type are until our web part itself has been initialized. So what we'll do is we'll create a kind of a one-time setup method that can be called from our web part on initialization lifecycle method, and then that will initialize this service manager one time when the web part first starts, and then we can reuse all the methods in here thereafter, and they'll have a context and an environment type. So that'll look like this. We'll create public setup, which will accept a context of type web part context, and an environment type of type environment type. This will return void. And within here, it will simply set this.context equals context, and this.environment type equals environment type. And with this setup method in place, what we can now do is we can jump into our web part entry file, and here we can say SharePoint service dot setup with this.context and environment dot type. And by using autocomplete, SharePoint service was actually imported. So you'll see up here, we actually imported the SharePoint service from that file that we created. And now it is running the setup method when the web part is initialized. Great. So now that this has been initialized, we can create some methods within this service manager that can be used in our application to do things like get lists and all that good stuff. So what we'll do first is we'll create a public get method. So just like our SP HTTP client has a get method, we want kind of a generic get method in this class that can be used by all the other methods in this class to make a get request. And what this will do is it's going to take a relative endpoint URL, which is of type string, and it's going to return a promise of type any. And all of the SPHTTP client methods like get, fetch, and post, they work with promises. So you're going to have to work with promises in this method as well, because it's basically going to return that SPHTTP client method itself, which will return a promise. And this will return this.context.SPHTTP-client.get. And within here, we'll set up a template string, and we can automatically go ahead and get this.context.pagecontext.web.absolute URL. So we'll always automatically add the current web's absolute URL, and then we can simply add the relative endpoint URL onto the end of that to create our full URL. Let me close the sidebar so we have a little more room here. So that'll just basically take the absolute URL and add our relative endpoint URL on the end of that. And just as before, we'll go ahead and set up the configuration for this by passing in SPHTTP client.configurations.v1. Then we'll take our response and we will return response.json. So that's basically going to return the promise, the JSON promise from this get method itself. So we're doing the same thing we did before, except instead of logging our JSON, we're just returning that JSON promise itself so that any other method that needs to use this can get the data from its return. We should also catch errors. And the way we can do that is we can just say .catch, and then with our error, we can set return promise.reject with that error. And what that'll do is basically anytime this promise up here fails, it's going to catch that and it's going to send back a promise rejection. So we're still returning a promise from this method, which is required because we always need to return a promise, but it's actually going to return a rejection. And that's going to be really handy because now whenever our React components, for example, make a GET request, they can also catch the rejection, and they can do something like show an error message inside of the component to indicate that something actually went wrong. Very cool. So we've done all the same things we did before, but right now you'd have to pass in the relative endpoint URL, and you'd have to know what you're getting to be able to use this. So we can also create some kind of friendly helper methods within here. For example, we could create public get lists. And the get list could return a promise. And for now, let's just do of type any because we don't know what that list interface looks like. And within here, we could say return this.get, and then the get method takes a relative endpoint URL. So we could simply say /API/lists. And that's all we have to do. If we want to get the list from our current web, we just have to call this get list. And it very simply just returns this.get. And that's going to handle all the error handling and making sure we call the response.json. But all we have to focus on when we're actually creating these helper methods is just do this.get, which is very, very simple, very easy to understand whenever you're looking at what this method does. And not only that, but if you actually want to use this in your application, for example, after we do the setup here in our on initialization, let's just say SharePoint service.get lists. And then we can say .then with our lists, we can console.log lists. How simple is that? So let's save this, and in our remote workbench, let's just give this a try to make sure everything's working okay. It's basically going to do the exact same thing we did before, where it's going to console log those lists, that value array of 50 lists in our current site, but we've kind of hidden all the logic and all that stuff in this nice little abstraction class, this SharePoint service, where we simply need to say, get your lists, and then with your lists, do something with them. Very cool. So this has a couple of issues that we could improve upon further. So first of all, it's still not working inside of our local workbench. If I scroll up a bit, you'll see it's still doing the same thing we did before where we're failing to fetch because it's still trying to actually make a web request to an API that doesn't exist. And not only that, but we don't have any IntelliSense. So when I say list dot, this is a generic right now. It's of type any, so it's not actually typed. So there's a couple of ways that we can improve this. First of all, let's create an interface to describe what a list looks like in our SharePoint REST services. And basically, we need to make it look just like our network response that you see over here in the remote workbench. So let's open up our sidebar and we'll create in this SharePoint folder, we'll create an interface called ilist.ts. And within here, we'll export interface ilist, which will have an ID of type string and a title of type string. Now, you could go through the work of documenting all the properties on a list. That seems like overkill, in my opinion. Maybe somebody's done that already. I don't know. But I know that in our application, the only thing I care about is this ID string. So you can see that here, and the title string that is down here. So it's basically the unique identifier for the list and kind of a nice friendly display name for the list. You can certainly, depending on what your application cares about, you can add some other properties in that as well, like the item count. Maybe you care about how many items are inside of that particular list. But in our case, what we'll do is we'll just kind of use our expansion pattern. We can say index of type string is going to be of type any because we know that other things exist on this interface. And we should also create an interface to describe what this whole response looks like. So you're either going to make a request and retrieve a single list, which is going to look like this. The JSON will actually be in this format. Or you're going to make a request and get a list collection, where you're going to get multiple lists. And this is what that JSON looks like. You have a value property on the JSON object, which is an array of lists. So let's create export interface ilist collection. Is going to have a value of ilist array, like so. So we've both described the list as well as a collection of lists. And now that we have that, we can jump back into our SharePoint service and we can actually specify when you say get list, you're actually going to get an ilist collection. And it's going to import that up at the top here, right there, ilist collection from that file we just created. But we have now typed the JSON response that comes back. So now in our dash web part where we're console logging lists, I can say list dot, and it knows it has a value, which is an array. So if I take an instance of that and say dot, it also knows it has an ID and a title, which is very, very good. So we definitely want to type these. It's going to just improve that developer experience and add that developer confidence that's so great with your TypeScript. And it's all you have to do is create an interface to describe that content and then specify that as your return type in your helper method here. Now that we have that, we could also fix the issue in our local workbench by creating some mock lists that this can use instead of making an actual web request. So one thing you could do is you could come down here in our getList method and you could just simply say if this.environmentType is equal to environmentType dot local. So we would have to return a new promise where it's going to resolve with some sort of JSON data. So it's immediately going to resolve as opposed to going and returning the get method, which will actually go out and get an API. But this resolve must return data in the format of ilist collection. So that means it must have a value array. And within that array, we must have some list data that has an ID of some string and then a title of some string. And you'll see now that we've added that, if we save this and go back to our local workbench, let me clear the console. And let's scroll up just a bit to find that. You'll see there it's actually not failing. It's no longer throwing an error, but it's actually giving us instead our mock data that we just created. Now, I know that there are situations where you might have multiple helper methods that are going to also export the same mock data. So rather than hard coding this in here, let's just create some sort of variable that we're going to import called mock list collection. And what we can do is we can create an external file to actually store this information, keep it nice and separate, and keep this file nice and concise. And we'll just go over here and create a data folder. And within that, we'll create a file called mocklistcollection.ts. And in this file, we want to export a const mocklistCollection, which is of type ilistCollection. It's going to import that at the top, and this is going to equal a JSON object, just like we did before, where it has a value array. And then within the value array, we can place our mock data here. I've already created some mock data. I'm just going to paste that in. All I've done is just kind of randomly generated some GUIDs or some IDs that look like they do when you actually make a real request. And we're just returning sample list 1, 2, and 3. If you want to follow along exactly, you can copy and paste this from the source code link in the video description down below. You can find that there. Or you can just put in here whatever you want. You just need to make sure you have an ID and a title, and you can make up your own mock data. It really doesn't matter. But we've created this mock list collection, and we can now import that into our SharePoint service. Up here, we can import mock list collection from that file we just created, which is in data/mock list collection. So now it's going to do the same thing in the local workbench. If we clear here, except it's going to return that mock data that we just provided. So you'll see here's our value array, and there are our 3 mock lists. Great. And likewise in the remote workbench, this is going to continue to work just the same. So instead of returning mock data, it'll actually return a real response. Very cool. So another thing you could do to kind of improve this is, for example, you could add all kinds of method parameters to your helper methods within this class to help you kind of customize your endpoint that you create. So for example, inside of our response in our remote workbench, you have 50 lists. And a lot of these are actually hidden lists. Like if you open up a lot of these and you go down to the title, this one's called app packages. It's not actually intended to be visible. It's just kind of something that needs to be there for SharePoint to function. And a lot of these behind the scenes you won't see in the UI because they have a hidden property that is set to true. But we're retrieving all lists, so we're not actually filtering out the hidden ones. So for example, we could add a parameter to this getList method that is called show hidden lists of type Boolean, and that could default to false. So we don't want to show hidden lists unless we specify we actually want to do that. And then now with that in place, down here we could change this to a template string, like so. And then we could have a ternary operator in here to kind of add that filter if you've decided to hide your list. So if we are not showing hidden lists, then add a template string, otherwise add an empty string. And what we'll do is we'll add $filter equals hidden equals false. And now if we save that, this is just that OData filter syntax that we used previously to filter out list items, but in this case we're filtering out hidden lists. If we go back to our remote desktop and remote workbench rather and refresh, you'll see here we're only getting 21 lists now. So we filtered out all of the hidden ones by default. Cool. So I know we're going to want to create a couple other helper methods here that we're going to need in our Dash application. For example, we need a method to get list items is in addition to just getting all of the lists in our current web. So let's create that now. We're going to use the same technique we used up above. This should be a little bit easier this time. We'll just create public get list items. This is going to need to take a list ID. You can get lists by title, which we did before, but typically the title can change. The ID cannot, so it's a little safer to use the list ID when you're trying to get items because you're going to keep that reference no matter what. And then we can also optionally provide selected fields, which will be a string array. So that's just like before where we selected only a subset of the fields we wanted to retrieve from our list items when we were getting that, what was it called, the produce revenue list or whatever it was, and we only selected the January and the February produce income. So what we can do here is we can optionally pass an array of what fields you want to select, and then that will automatically add that OData selected expression onto the end of the web request URL. This is going to return a promise, which for now we'll do of type any. We'll create an interface to describe these in just a moment. But what it's going to do is it's going to do the same thing we did up here, but we're going to return a mock list item collection, which we haven't created yet, but we will, and if we are local. And then instead of doing API/lists, let's go ahead and change this URL down here to be API/list/get by ID. And then we'll paste in our list ID here. And then we'll get /items. And that's going to get all of the items in the list ID that you provide to this method. But if you also want to add the ability to provide selected fields, we can add an expression onto the end of this template string that says if selected fields is truthy, meaning it has items, then add this template string onto the end of it. Otherwise, add an empty string. And what that select syntax looks like, it's going to be question mark select equals. And then we can take our selected fields and then join them with a comma. So let's create an interface to describe these list items as well as a mock list item collection. So we will go over to our SharePoint folder. We'll create ilistitem.ts. And just like in our list interface, we're going to export interface ilistitem. And this will have an ID of type number. And then it could have any number of other things. Typically, list items have a title, which we could put in here, but not always. You can actually delete the title of the content type in a list if you want to. So we'll just simply say, we know it has an ID. It could have a lot of other things too. We don't know. So this will be kind of a very generic typing or a very generic interface for this. So then we'll allow for expansion, and then we'll also export interface ilistitem collection, which again will be a value of ilistitem array, like so. Cool. So let's create a mock list item collection, mock list item collection.ts, and this will export const mock list item collection, which is of type ilistitem collection. And that's going to equal a JSON object where we have, again, a value array, and this is going to contain our mock data. And once again, I have some data I can paste in here. This has an ID on each one of these. It has a title, and then we have this quarterly earnings data and total. I'm just doing this because I know in this dash web part, we're going to want to play around with charting. We want to chart some data. So I added just some number fields in here because you can't really do much with charts unless you have some numeric data. So in our mock data here, we have these earnings and this total that we'll use when we get to that charting point. You can totally put in whatever you want here, or again, if you want to have the exact same data that we're using in the lesson recording, you can go to the source code link in the video description down below, and you can just copy and paste the exact same data that we're using here. So let's go ahead and save this. We have our mock list item collection completed. We can now go ahead and import that into our SharePoint service. So I'll just duplicate this one and add item to it. And then you'll see down here in our get list items, this is now a working method. Great. So if we want to test this, we do need the ID of a list. I think I previously saw number 13 is, yeah, it's just a dummy list we have called product development. So let's just copy the ID from this for now. We'll copy this unique ID. And now in our web part entry file, we can SharePoint service.get list items. And again, that takes a list ID, which in this case we'll pass that in. And also it can optionally take selected fields. Let's not pass those for now. We'll just say .then with our list items, or just items rather, we can console.log items. And let's make sure that this works both in our local and remote workbench. So locally, let me give that another refresh. Let's scroll up. Sure enough, in that second request, you can see our mock data that we provided. And then in the actual real request, if we refresh here, whenever that comes back, we'll get 2 responses. And the second one, well, that's actually the list, but the first one that came back does actually have the items from that product development list. Looks like it's working great. Cool. So let's jump back into our SharePoint service. We have one other helper method I want to add here that we're going to need for our dash web part, and that is to get the fields or the columns for a particular list. And that's just another element of ambiguity when it comes to SharePoint terminology. In the technical documentation, typically a site column or a column on a list is actually referred to as a field, but fields and columns are interchangeable in SharePoint. They mean the exact same thing. So what we'll do is we're going to create a public get list fields, and that's going to take, again, a list ID of type string. And we also want to hide hidden fields if possible, just like we're showing hidden list up here. We'll add a show hidden fields as a type boolean equals false, because there are a lot of fields, as you saw in our web requests, that come back on your responses, and you just don't need all those hidden ones because they just kind of add a lot of noise. So what we'll do here is this is going to return a promise, which will create an interface for fields in a moment. But just like our list items, it's going to do the exact same thing, but it's going to return a mock list field collection that we'll create. And the endpoint itself will be similar to items. However, it's just going to get fields instead. And if we want to use this show hidden fields, let's replace this selected fields expression with, if you're not showing hidden fields, then add something, otherwise add an empty string. And it's going to do the same thing we did up here, where we're just adding this filter hidden equals false. Let me make that a little bit wider so you can see that. But basically, it's just getting the list, and then it's getting the fields on the list. And then if you're not showing hidden fields, it's going to add this filter hidden equals false onto the end of the URL. Very similar to our get list, and very similar to the get items, we're just getting fields in this case, or columns on that particular list. So now we need to create an interface and the mock list data for our fields. So let's go do that now to finish this up. We'll create ilistfield.ts. It's going to export interface ilistfield. And your fields, like your list items and lists, they do have an ID of type string. They also have a title of type string, and we also need an internal name of type string. And one thing to note about fields or columns in SharePoint is that what you see when you go to the actual columns in the UI does not necessarily equal what you're going to use in your web service requests. And what I mean by that is there is an internal name to all of your columns or your fields, and then there's a actual display name, which they call the title. And typically you need to use the internal name when you're actually making requests. And that's just a little bit confusing. It's just something you have to get used to in SharePoint REST services. But in this case, we'll get both the title and the internal name in case we want to use either one of those. You can also get the type of field if you want. There's a property on here called type as string, which will say like it's a text field or it's a number field, which could be handy if you do want to use that. It's kind of optional, but we'll add that as well. And then we'll add our expansion here because there's some other stuff on there as well. We know that exists, but our application doesn't necessarily really care about it in this case. And we'll also export interface ilist field collection. Oops, I missed an R there. And within here, this will have a value array of ilist field. Great. And finally, back in our SharePoint service, let's change our any generic here to ilist field collection. And it will have imported that up at the top. And we also, let me move these interfaces together. Oh, and it looks like I forgot to add the typing on our items. So let's add that real quick. That's going to be ilist item collection. I noticed that wasn't imported at the top. So let's move all three of those together. We have ilist collection, ilist item collection, ilist field collection. Then we have our list mock list collection, mock list item collection. And finally, we need to create our mock list field collection so that we can import that in here as well. So let's create a new file over here, mock list field collection.ts. And this will export a const mock list field collection of type ilist field collection. That's going to equal a JSON object with a value array as always. And once again, I will paste in some fields that I've already prepared. Each one of these has a unique ID. It has an internal name as well as a title, and then that type as string as well. And again, you can find this in the source code and the link down below this video if you want to follow along exactly, or you can feel free to create your own mock data, whatever you'd like to do. So now that that's created, let's jump back in here and we will duplicate this line and we'll change this to field. And now we've imported all three of our mock data, all three of our interfaces, and let's just double check that mock list field collection is down here. Awesome. So I just want to test this to make sure we didn't have any errors or bugs. So I'm going to do the same thing we did up above in our entry file here. Let me space these out a bit so you can see those a little better. So we're getting our list, we're getting our list items, and then we're going to get our list fields from that same list that we got up above. And then we're going to take our fields and we'll console.log those. So let's give this a refresh here. And then our third console log should log fields, which it does indeed. So you can see our mock data is working in the local workbench. Then if we refresh the remote workbench, it should make a web request and get the fields off of the list. So let's go to the fields request. It has 27 items that came back. So there's actually 27 fields that are returned. And finally, to finish this up, there's one other little thing we should do. This is actually something I discovered while recording this series that we need to fix. And that is in our get method up here. Sometimes for whatever reason, whenever you run this SP HTTP clients get method, it doesn't always reject or it doesn't always go to your catch method on failure. So for example, if you make a request to something that returns 404 not found, it will actually still resolve with a response, but the response doesn't actually have any JSON, which can cause some issues in your application. So the way we can fix this is we can just add a new line up here that says if the response is not okay, they have this Boolean on the response that is just .ok that tells you whether or not it was successful. And if it's not okay, we can just return promise.reject and say get request failed. And that's going to fix any issues you might have with your requests not being thrown to your catch in this case, which is going to be important when we do some error handling in future lessons. But for now, just go ahead and add that line here, and that should fix it up, and you should be good to go. Great. So our SharePoint service class is now complete. We're now going to use this to actually build out some functionality inside of our application so we can start to bring this Dash web part to life. I do want to go ahead and delete these kind of test methods that we created here. We're not going to need those. And what we're going to do in the next lesson is we're actually going to import this service into some of our React components and start to test the functionality there and learn how we can use this service class to actually update our component state in our application to show things like our lists and our list items that we're requesting and receiving.